Imagine standing on the precipice of the known world. Behind you lie the comforts of civilization, warm hearths, mapped roads, and the certainty of law. Ahead of you stretches a continent of silence and shadow. It is 1804. The map of the United States ends at the Mississippi River. Beyond that churning, muddy water lies a void on the parchment, a blank space labeled simply Terra Incognita. There are no highways, no outposts, no guarantees of return. There is only the wind howling through the tall grass of the prairies and the jagged, snow-capped teeth of mountains rumored to touch the stars. Into this void stepped 33 souls. They were not just explorers, they were ghosts walking into a legend. This is the story of the Corps of Discovery, a journey that would rewrite history, break spirits, and forge the destiny of a nation. The story begins not with the dipping of an oar, but with the scratch of a quill in a quiet room in Washington City. It was the dream of Thomas Jefferson, a man of intellect and curiosity, who looked west and saw more than just land. He saw the future. But to claim that future, he needed eyes and ears on the ground. He needed men who could endure the unendurable. He chose Meriwether Lewis, a man of brooding intensity and skilled woodcraft, and William Clark, a gregarious, red-haired artillery officer with a steady hand and a talent for map-making. Together, they formed the dual command that would lead the most ambitious expedition in American history. The preparation itself was a monumental feat of logistics, a detailed puzzle that would determine life or death. The winter of 1803 was spent not in idleness, but in the frantic accumulation of supplies. Lewis, meticulous to a fault, traveled to Philadelphia to study botany, celestial navigation, and medicine under the leading minds of the day. He bought chronometers and sextants, knowing that getting lost in the vast wilderness was a death sentence. But it was the hardware that told the true story of their journey. They packed nearly 200 pounds of portable soup, a gluey, nutrient-dense concoction that no one enjoyed but would eventually keep them from starvation. They packed candles, lanterns, and mosquito curtains. They packed presents for the indigenous tribes they would encounter, beads, mirrors, sewing needles, and tobacco, and weapons. They carried rifles, powder horns, and a prototype air rifle that fired using compressed air, a marvel of technology meant to impress and intimidate. But the centerpiece of their equipment was the keelboat, 55 feet long, with a mast that could be raised or lowered. It was a floating fortress. It was designed to battle the mighty Missouri River, a beast of a waterway that was known to shift its banks, hide treacherous sandbars, and drag entire trees beneath its swirling surface. The boat had to be rowed, sailed, or, in the worst conditions, cordelled, pulled by men walking along the muddy banks with long ropes, fighting the current step by agonizing step. On May 14, 1804, the expedition officially departed from Camp Dubois, near present-day St. Louis. The mood was electric, a mix of bravado and unspoken anxiety. The crew was a motley collection of rough-hewn men, Kentucky woodsmen, French boatmen, soldiers, and Clark's enslaved manservant, York. And there was Seaman, Lewis's Newfoundland dog, a loyal beast who would become as much a member of the Corps as any man. As they pushed off into the Missouri, the Big Muddy, the reality of their undertaking set in immediately.
The current was relentless, a physical force that seemed to want to push them back to the safety of the East. In those early days, progress was measured not in miles, but in yards. The men's hands blistered and bled as they hauled on the oars and ropes. The heat of the Missouri summer descended upon them, a humid blanket that sapped their strength and brought with it clouds of mosquitoes so thick that they could be inhaled. Lewis, writing in his journal, noted the landscape with the eye of a scientist and the soul of a poet. He described the vast rolling prairies that stretched to the horizon, oceans of grass rippling in the wind. He catalogued new species of birds and plants, his curiosity insatiable even as his body grew weary. Every bend of the river brought a new vista, a new danger, or a new marvel.
One afternoon, disaster nearly struck. The keelboat, caught in a sudden, violent squall, heeled over, threatening to capsize and spill their precious supplies and their lives into the turbid water. It was the quick thinking of Pierre Cruzat, their one-eyed, fiddle-playing boatman, that saved them. He bellowed orders over the roar of the wind, steering the bow into the waves just in time. The men bailed water frantically, their hearts hammering against their ribs. It was a stark reminder. Out here, nature was not a backdrop, it was an adversary. As they moved north and west, the landscape began to change. The trees thinned, giving way to the Great Plains. Here they encountered herds of buffalo so vast they darkened the earth, a thundering sea of fur and horn that took hours to pass. For men from the settled East, it was a sight that defied comprehension. The abundance of game was staggering. Elk, deer, and antelope were plentiful, but so were the predators. The grizzly bear, a creature of myth and terror to the tribes of the region, was soon to become a very real nightmare for the Corps. Lewis had dismissed the native accounts of the bear's ferocity as exaggeration. He would learn the hard way. One day, while hunting alone, Lewis spotted a grizzly. He fired, wounding the animal. Instead of fleeing, the bear charged. It was a monster of muscle and rage, covering the ground with terrifying speed. Lewis ran, his rifle empty, diving into the river to escape the slashing claws. He realized then that their small-caliber rifles, sufficient for deer, were woefully inadequate against the kings of this wilderness. The grizzly would become a recurring character in their nightmares, a symbol of the untamable land they sought to cross. By late October 1804, the days grew shorter, and the bite of frost appeared on the grass each morning. They had traveled 1,600 miles against the current. They needed a place to winter. They found a suitable location near the villages of the Mandan and Hidatsa tribes in present-day North Dakota. Here they built Fort Mandan, a rough collection of log huts that would be their home for the next 5 months. The winter of 1804-1805 was brutal. Temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. The river froze solid, a ribbon of white ice. Inside the fort, the men huddled around fires, the smoke stinging their eyes. But it was here, in the freezing cold, that the expedition's luck turned. They met a French-Canadian trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau, a man of questionable character but useful skills. More importantly, they met his wife, a teenage Shoshone girl named Sacagawea. Sacagawea was pregnant, quiet, and observant. Lewis and Clark realized that she could be the key to their success.
She spoke the language of the Shoshone, a tribe that lived in the Rocky Mountains, the very mountains the Corps would need to cross. The Shoshone possessed horses, and without horses the expedition would surely perish in the high peaks. They hired Charbonneau largely to secure the services of Sacagawea. On February 11, 1805, inside the smoky, crowded fort, Sacagawea gave birth to a son, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. Louis, playing the role of doctor, administered a potion of crushed rattlesnake rattle to speed the labor, a folk remedy that surprisingly seemed to work. The arrival of the baby, whom Clark affectionately nicknamed Pomp, brought a touch of softness to the hardened military encampment. It was a sign of hope in the dead of winter. As spring approached, the ice on the Missouri began to break apart with the sound of cannon fire. The time had come to leave the known world behind completely. On April 7, 1805, Louis wrote perhaps the most famous entry in his journal. He described the moment of departure from Fort Mandan. A small group of men was sent back down river to St. Louis with maps, reports, and specimens for President Jefferson. The rest of the Corps, 33 people, including Sacagawea and her infant son, turned their faces west. We were now about to penetrate a country at least 2,000 miles in width, on which the foot of civilized man had never trodden, Louis wrote. The good or evil it had in store for us was for experiment yet to determine, and these little vessels contained every article by which we were to expect to subsist or defend ourselves. They were sailing off the map. The river narrowed, the water grew clearer and swifter. The landscape transformed into a surreal badlands of sandstone formations, sculpted by wind and rain into castles and spires. The wildlife, too, changed. They saw bighorn sheep scaling sheer cliffs and beavers building massive dams, but the beauty was matched by the toil. The current was so strong that the men often had to tow the heavy dugout canoes from the shore, wading waist-deep in freezing water, their feet cut by sharp rocks and pierced by prickly pear cactus spines.
In late May, they saw the Rocky Mountains for the first time. They were distant, jagged clouds on the horizon, glowing white in the sun. To Louis, they were a source of awe and dread. He knew that somewhere in those peaks lay the continental divide, the spine of the continent. But he also knew that the easy water route to the Pacific, the Northwest Passage that Jefferson had hoped for, was a myth. There was no river that cut through those mountains. They would have to climb. Before they could reach the mountains, they faced a confusion of geography. The river forked. One branch flowed muddy and turbulent, the other was clear and swift. Which was the true Missouri? If they chose wrong, they could lose months of travel and be trapped by winter in the wilderness. The captains scouted, debated, and finally, against the opinion of the rest of the men, chose the southern fork. To prove they were right, Louis took a small advance party to find the great falls of the Missouri, which the natives had described. On June 13th, Louis heard a distant roar. Following the sound, he crested a hill and saw it, the spray of the great falls rising like smoke against the blue sky. It was a magnificent sight, the grandest waterfall he had ever seen. But as he explored further, his heart sank. It wasn't just one waterfall, it was 5,
a succession of cataracts stretching for miles. This was not a simple obstacle, it was a wall of water. The portage around the Great Falls would become one of the most grueling chapters of the expedition. They had to take the heavy canoes out of the water and drag them 18 miles over rough, cactus-strewn ground. They built makeshift wagons using the trunk of a cottonwood tree for wheels. The heat was blistering, the hailstorms sudden and violent. The men, exhausted and malnourished, their feet pierced by cactus spines, harnessed themselves to the wagons like draft animals. It took them nearly a month to cover those 18 miles. It was a testament to their sheer, stubborn will. They were broken, bleeding, but they did not stop. Above the falls, the river became a calm, clear stream, winding through a valley that Lewis named the Gates of the Mountains. Enormous limestone cliffs rose vertically from the water's edge, creating a dark, cool canyon. It was hauntingly beautiful, but the season was advancing. It was July. They had not yet found the Shoshone. They had not yet found the horses, and the peaks of the Rockies loomed ever closer, silent sentinels guarding the way to the ocean. Anxiety began to gnaw at the captains. Without horses, they could not cross the mountains with their supplies. Without horses, they would be trapped. Lewis went ahead with a small scouting party, desperate to make contact. He walked for days, scanning the horizon for the smoke of a campfire or the silhouette of a rider. He was walking into the heart of the Shoshone territory, hoping that he would not be met with arrows. Finally, on August 11th, Lewis saw a lone native on horseback. He waved a blanket, a sign of friendship, and shouted, "Tababone," a word he thought meant white man, but which might have meant stranger or enemy in the local dialect. The rider paused, looked at this strange, sunburned man, and then turned his horse and vanished into the hills. Lewis was crushed. Had he lost their only chance?
Desperation has a specific taste. For Meriwether Lewis, wandering the high ridges of the Continental Divide in August 1805, it tasted like dust and dry sage. He was days ahead of the main party, his boots worn thin, his eyes scanning the horizon for the Shoshone. He knew the clock was ticking. The air was already thinning, the nights growing colder. Winter comes early to the high country. Without horses to carry their gear over the peaks, the Corps of Discovery would be trapped in a snowy tomb. On August 13, his luck finally broke. In a narrow valley, he encountered 3 Shoshone women. They were terrified, bowing their heads as if expecting execution. Lewis, putting down his rifle, rolled up his sleeve to show his white skin, a stark contrast to his sun-beaten face, and offered them trinkets, paint, beads, mirrors, the universal language of peace. Through hesitant sign language and the few words he had gathered, he persuaded them to lead him to their camp. The meeting with the Shoshone chief, Cameawait, was a delicate dance of diplomacy. Lewis was the first white man these people had ever seen. He spoke of a great father in the East, of trade, of peace. But what he really needed was a transaction, guns for horses. The negotiations were slow, hampered by the lack of a common tongue. Lewis waited anxiously for Clark and the main party to catch up, knowing that their arrival would either seal the deal or doom them.
When Clark's group finally arrived a few days later, a scene unfolded that would defy the wildest fiction. As the boats were pulled up the shallow stream, Sacagawea, the young Shoshone interpreter, began to dance with joy. She pointed to the crowd of natives, sucking her fingers, a sign that these were her people, the ones who had nursed her. She was brought into the council tent to interpret. As she began to translate the chief's words, she paused. She looked at Cameawait closely. Then, with a cry that startled the hardened soldiers, she jumped up and ran to him, throwing her blanket over his head and weeping. Cameawait was her brother. The very man Lewis was negotiating with was the brother Sacagawea had been stolen from years ago. The reunion changed everything. The tension evaporated. The Shoshone, though poor and hungry themselves, agreed to trade. They provided the expedition with horses, skinny, tough mountain ponies that could navigate the goat paths of the Rockies. They also provided a guide, an old man the explorers nicknamed Old Toby. He claimed to know a path across the mountains to the river that flowed to the sea. The path Old Toby chose was the Lolo Trail. It was not a road, it was a scar running along the spine of the Bitterroot Mountains. The crossing began in September, but the mountains did not care for the calendar. As they ascended, the rain turned to sleet, and the sleet turned to snow. The trail was treacherous, steep, slippery, and cluttered with fallen timber. The horses, laden with heavy packs, slipped and fell down the steep embankments. The men, their moccasins rotting from the damp, scrambled down to retrieve them, hauling the terrified animals back up the slopes by sheer willpower. Then the food ran out. The game that had been so plentiful on the plains, the buffalo, the elk, vanished. The high mountains were a barren wasteland. The men ate the last of their salt pork. They ate the portable soup, which had turned into a rock-hard glue. Finally, faced with starvation, they turned to the unthinkable. They began to kill their horses. They ate the colts first, then the older pack animals. There was no fire to cook the meat properly, just smoky, wet wood that hissed in the snow. They ate the meat boiled, drinking the grease to fill the hollow ache in their stomachs. Lewis, usually so disciplined, wrote in his journal that he had never been so hungry in his life. The men were skeletal, their eyes sunken, dysentery ravaging their weakened bodies. They were walking through a white void. The snow was knee-deep, hiding the trail. Old Toby, confused by the shifting landscape, sometimes lost the way, forcing them to backtrack miles through the freezing slush. Morale hit rock bottom. There were no jokes around the fire, only the silence of exhaustion and the wind howling through the pines. They were ghost men, marching towards an end they could not see. On September 22, 1805, the starving expedition staggered out of the tree line and looked down. Below them lay a vast prairie of golden grass, the White Prairie. It was warm, it was green, and there were people. They had reached the lands of the Nez Perce. The Nez Perce could have easily wiped out the weakened strangers. In fact, a tribal council debated killing them for their weapons. They were saved by the words of an elderly woman named Watkuwais, who had once been treated kindly by white traders in Canada. "Do them no harm," she told the warriors. And so, instead of death, the Corps found salvation. The Nez Perce fed them roots and dried salmon. The sudden abundance of food made many of the men violently ill, their shrunken stomachs unable to handle the feast, but they survived. Recovered but still weary, the Corps faced a new challenge. The horses could go no further. They needed to return to the water. The Nez Perce directed them to the Clearwater River, a tributary of the Snake, which flowed into the Columbia. On the banks of the Clearwater, the men became carpenters again. They felled massive ponderosa pines, hollowing them out not with saws, but with fire and adzes, adopting the native method of canoe building. These were not the sturdy keelboats of the Missouri. These were dugouts, long, heavy, unstable logs that rode low in the water. On October 7th, they pushed their new fleet into the current. The water here was different. It was fast, clear, and rushed westward with a terrifying speed. They were no longer fighting the river. They were riding it. They shot through rapids that would have terrified lesser boatmen. The Snake River joined the Columbia, a massive artery of water that widened until the far banks were just hazy lines. The landscape changed again, from the dry plateau to a wet, gray world of mist and towering fir trees. They had entered the Pacific Northwest. And with the landscape, the weather turned. The rain began. It was not a storm. It was a condition of existence. It rained day and night. It rained until their leather clothes rotted on their backs. It rained until their mats were soaked, their food moldy, their spirits dampened. They camped on narrow, rocky beaches, pinned between the river and the steep cliffs, tormented by fleas that swarmed their bedding in the millions. But the river was widening. The water began to taste brackish, salty. The tides began to lift and lower their boats, a rhythmic breathing of the ocean reaching inland.
On November 7th, 1805, the fog lifted. William Clark, peering through the gray drizzle, saw a horizon that did not end in land, but in a rolling, gray infinity. He sat down and scrawled in his field notes a sentence that captured the relief of 18 months of struggle. Ocean in view. Oh, the joy! They hadn't actually reached the ocean yet. They were in the massive estuary of the Columbia River, but the end was there. They could hear the roar of the breakers. Reaching the actual coast, however, proved to be one final test. Violent winter storms pinned them down for weeks at a place they called Dismal Niche. The waves were so high they threw massive logs around like matchsticks. The wind screamed, forcing them to hide in crevices in the rocks, soaked, cold, and living on pounded salmon. Finally, the weather broke. They crossed the river to the south side, present-day Oregon, to build their winter quarters. They found a site protected by trees near a herd of elk that would provide meat. They named it Fort Clatsop, after the local tribe. As the men felled trees to build the log palisade that would shelter them for the winter, the reality of their achievement began to settle in. They had done it. They had walked across the continent. They had drawn a line of ink from the Mississippi to the Pacific. But as the rain hammered down on the roof of Fort Clatsop, it would rain for all but 12 days of their 3-month stay. A new thought began to occupy their minds, a thought that was both comforting and terrifying. They had to go back.
The winter of 1805 to 1806 on the Oregon coast was a test of psychological endurance. The rain was relentless. It fell in a gray curtain that dissolved the distinction between sky and earth. Inside the small, smoke-filled rooms of the fort, the men battled boredom and rot. Their clothes, made of leather, grew moldy on their backs. Fleas infested their bedding, a constant, itching torment that made sleep difficult. The diet was monotonous. Elk meat, lean, stringy elk meat, day after day. When the elk migrated away from the fort, the men had to hunt further afield, hauling the heavy carcasses miles through the freezing rain. They longed for bread. They longed for salt. They boiled ocean water in kettles to scrape a few ounces of gray salt from the bottom, a desperate attempt to add flavor to their dreary meals. Yet even in this misery, the work continued. Clark, ever the draftsman, spent the long, dark hours drawing detailed maps of the route they had taken. Lewis filled his journals with descriptions of the local flora and fauna, sketching the leaf of a fir tree or the beak of a bird with scientific precision. They were documenting a world that was already changing. By March 1806, the Corps could wait no longer. The elk were gone. The men were restless. Although the mountain passes were likely still blocked by snow, they decided to leave. They gifted the fort to the local Clatsop chief, turned their backs on the Pacific Ocean, and began the long row upstream.
The journey home was faster, but no less dangerous. They traded their canoes for horses again with the Nez Perce, reclaiming the animals they had left in the tribe's care the previous autumn. The Nez Perce had kept their word. The horses were healthy and strong. But the snow in the Bitterroot Mountains was still deep. Their first attempt to cross in June failed, forcing a humiliating retreat. For the first time, the Corps had to turn back. It was a stark reminder that they were guests in this wilderness, not masters. They waited, watching the snow line recede with agonizing slowness. Finally, in late June, with the help of Nez Perce guides who knew the high trails, they crossed the terrible mountains one last time. They emerged back on the eastern side, bruised but alive. At a place called Traveler's Rest, the captains made a bold, perhaps reckless decision. To cover more ground and map more territory, they would split the Corps into two groups. Clark would take a group south to explore the Yellowstone River. Lewis would take a group north to explore the Marias River, hoping to find that elusive northern boundary of the Louisiana Purchase. It was a dangerous gamble. Dividing their forces in hostile territory left both groups vulnerable. But their confidence was high. They were veterans now. They had walked across the world and back. Lewis took 3 men, Drouillard and the Field brothers, and rode north. This detour would lead to the only bloodshed of the entire expedition. They were entering the territory of the Blackfeet, the most powerful and feared military force on the northern plains. The Blackfeet controlled the gun trade with the British to the north and viewed American interlopers as a direct threat to their dominance. On the evening of July 26, 1806, along the Two-Medium River, Lewis's worst fears materialized.
They encountered a party of 8 young Blackfeet warriors. The meeting was tense. They shared a camp, but Lewis kept his guard up, sensing the underlying hostility. He told them of the United States, of peace and of trade with other tribes, tribes the Blackfeet considered enemies. This was a diplomatic error. To the Blackfeet, arming their enemies was an act of war. At dawn, chaos erupted. Lewis woke to the sound of shouting. The warriors were trying to steal their rifles and horses. In the desperate scuffle that followed, Reuben Field stabbed a warrior who was trying to wrestle his gun away. The warrior fell dead. Lewis, chasing another warrior who was driving off their horses, raised his rifle. He fired. The shot struck the warrior in the belly. The man returned fire, the bullet whistling past Lewis's ear before collapsing. 2 Blackfeet were dead. The peace of the expedition was broken. Knowing that the main Blackfeet war party could be nearby, Lewis and his 3 men fled. They rode for their lives. They covered 120 miles in 24 hours, riding their horses into the ground, fueled by pure adrenaline and the fear of capture. They didn't stop until they reached the banks of the Missouri, collapsing with relief only when they spotted the canoes of the main party coming down river.
Meanwhile, Clark's journey down the Yellowstone had been peaceful, notable mostly for the carving of his name into a sandstone pillar he called Pompey's Tower, after Sacagawea's son, and the maddening clouds of mosquitoes. The 2 groups reunited on the Missouri in August, but not before one final, bizarre accident occurred. While hunting elk in the thick willows, Meriwether Lewis was shot. He was dressed in brown leather. Pierre Cruzat, the one-eyed fiddle player, mistook his captain for an elk. The bullet passed through Lewis's left buttock, missing the bone, but inflicting a painful, jagged wound. For the final leg of the journey, the leader of the greatest expedition in American history lay face down in the bottom of a canoe, feverish and unable to walk, shot by his own man. As they floated down the Missouri, the current accelerated. They were moving back into the world of maps and cities. They passed the Mandan villages, where they said goodbye to Sacagawea and Charbonneau. Clark offered to take the baby, Pomp, to St. Louis to raise him as his own and educate him. Sacagawea, knowing the harsh life of the plains, agreed to send him when he was weaned. It was a tearful, quiet parting. The woman who had saved them, who had been their token of peace, stood on the bank and watched the boats drift away. They would never see her again. On September 23, 1806, a cool breeze blew across the Mississippi River waterfront in St. Louis. People on the shore stopped their work. They squinted at the ragged collection of canoes approaching from the north. The men in the boats were bearded, their skin dark as mahogany, dressed in tattered skins that looked more animal than human. They paddled with a rhythm that spoke of thousands of miles. A cry went up. "It's them! It's Lewis and Clark!" They had been gone for 2 years, 4 months, and 10 days. Most of the country had given them up for dead. Their return was a resurrection. The town erupted in celebration. Gun salutes fired, bells rang, and whiskey flowed. They had traveled over 8,000 miles.
They had mapped a continent. They had discovered 122 new species of animals and 178 new plants. They had done the impossible, and they had lost only one man, Sergeant Floyd, who died of a burst appendix early in the trip. They were heroes. But history, like the river, has a way of twisting. The glory of the return faded quickly for Meriwether Lewis. Appointed governor of the Louisiana Territory, he found himself ill-suited for the snake's den of politics. He was a man of the open horizon, not the desk. Plagued by depression, financial ruin, and perhaps the long-term effects of malaria or syphilis, his mind began to unravel. 3 years after the expedition, in a lonely inn on the Natchez Trace in Tennessee, Meriwether Lewis died of gunshot wounds. Whether it was murder or suicide remains a mystery to this day, though most historians believe the captain took his own life. The man who conquered the Rockies could not conquer his own demons. William Clark lived a long, full life. He became a brigadier general and the superintendent of Indian affairs. He kept his promise to Sacagawea, educating her son, Jean-Baptiste, who grew up to be a worldly traveler and guide in his own right. Clark remained a respected figure, a steady anchor to Lewis's volatile genius. And Sacagawea? She died young, likely of illness at a trading post just a few years after the expedition. But her name survived. She became a legend, a symbol of quiet strength and resilience, her face eventually minted on gold coins of the nation she helped explore. The core of discovery dissolved, the men scattering into the winds of the frontier, but they had left a mark that could not be erased. They had opened the door. Through it would pour trappers, settlers, miners, and dreamers. They ended the silence of the West. The map was no longer blank.